Good morning. Continuing our review and summary of Hemshech Ayin Beis. Conclusion. We are on volume 3, on page 1465. Top of 1465. And we're right in the middle of the Rebbe Rashab explaining, quoting, citing actually the Maimer of Hamagbil Shavis, which originates from the Alter Rebbe, but here the language is mostly from the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, as we had learned it, with additions and further explanation of the engagement and the relationship of the Nefesh Elikis and Nefesh Habamis. Initially, there are two diametric opposites. With the Nefesh Habamis, it's Seichel, for sure it's Midas, which are its impulses, its natural hardwiring, are driven by self-interest and its own existence and its own survival, and what he called its own needs, and then even the more sublime seichel is all about the yeshus and the gashmis of whatever it is Nefesh Habamis' understanding, even scientific wisdom. Nefesh Elikis, on the other hand, its entire focus and interest is Elikus, to understand godliness, the ruchnius within everything. So the two opposites. And the midas of Nefesh Elikis is all about being drawn to and connecting to godliness as well. So both mitzad the seichel and mitzad the midas, they're two opposites. Midas even more so, because the midas are not even guided by an intelligence; it's just the nature of that personality. And yet Hashem put them together. Nifloyes habayr, he called it. Minifloyes Hashem, that he puts them together to the point that the Nefesh Elikis is completely manifest, bislapsus, not passing through, not the peripherally, not as superficially, but completely enters like a slapshus into Nefesh Habamis, to the point k'mohus echad mamish. So every faculty of the divine soul manifests within the faculty of the animal soul. And he began to explain that with seichel, to example how it works. So what you see here is that two opposites are coming together and they're engaging with each other. And because of seichel, the seichel of Nefesh Elikis can speak to the seichel of Nefesh Habamis. That's ultimately the purpose of this whole exercise. Just 1 second. I wanted to just see one thing, language he used here. Okay, so what did he say? The bottom of page 1464. What a person conceives of an idea, a divine idea, in the koyach of chachma of the Nefesh Elikis, because that's what the Nefesh Elikis is interested in. Its only interest. That's misabish b'seichel ativ the Nefesh Habamis. To the point, as he said, the number of mishalim and dimyonis with examples and parallels and comparative studies and comparisons from dvarim tivim v'chumrim, which can be used to explain Elikus. Yes, indeed, that's still that the Nefesh Elikis has, and the key thing to remember that this is a constant balance, because on one hand, the Nefesh Elikis has descended from its natural state in Gan Eden above, where it doesn't have a Nefesh Habamis. So all it is involved in ruchnis, in godly understanding, a comprehension of godliness, like he said in the parentheses. So you can't compare the hasaga of the Nefesh Elikis lamata to the way it is lamayla. But nevertheless, even as it comes down below, it doesn't mean that it's lost its ability to understand. On the contrary, he said, it understands even inyanim amukim, v'gvoyim, u'be'emek, v'eirech, v'rechev. In other words, the divine soul below, even as it manifests in the animal soul, understands profound and sublime and high and lofty ideas in their depth and their length and their breadth and width. V'akol bo b'sichel hativi, with the common mishalim v'dimyonis. That's where we stopped. And we elaborated on that. So what you see here two things happening. On one hand, the nefesh elokis and nefesh habamis are opposites, and yet the nefesh elokis has the ability, like he said at the beginning of the paragraph on 1464, l'sakenas nefesh habamis, and how does it do so? Through the seichel of the nefesh habamis. So the seichel of one is communicating to the seichel of the other. Now, ultimately, in a way that helps us understand the role of seichel. As we discussed a number of times, that chachma and seichel is not just about understanding things, it's about experiencing reality greater than ourselves. So up to this point, you could argue the nefesh elokis does that. The nefesh habamis, ruach habehema yuredis lamata, is only interested what is lamata, what is below, the yeshes, the gashmis, its own needs and interests. But here we're coming to see how the nefesh elokis can actually educate and train the nefesh habamis, the seichel, to also appreciate that which is above itself, which is ultimately where we're headed here. But there's still more to go in this balance. So we're going to review now, we're going to learn now, continue, second line on page 1465, the parentheses, where again the Rebbe Rashab, parentheses, comes to explain it even further, because remember, you have to keep the nefesh elokis has to be commensurate to the nefesh habamis, and yet retain its divine nature and its divine seichel. So here's what he says.
So, and
The
then the
second line-
seichel activi for
the
nefesh
second
habamis
line-
is spoil on the midas, correct?
One second. The second line on page 1465, and the text can be seen at ayinbeis.com. What did you ask?
After the nefesh activi seichel is convinced of the nefesh elokis, then it's spoil on the midas of nefesh habamis, correct?
That v'ahavtas Hashem elekacha. That's what it's going to lead to. Yes, avos Hashem b'shnei b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. He's going to speak about that. That's a big part of the next section of Ayin Beis. In general, this is an approach of how you want to educate someone to get beyond their subjective interests. You know, let's say a person is dealing with any difficulties and they have all kinds of psychological fears or inhibitions or insecurities. So the way in general is you work from the mind to the heart, even though you have to show empathy and compassion, but ultimately the mind of a person allows you to be a little more objective. Even a subjective person who's sheikhid ya'avra einei chachamim, everyone's bias and prejudices, especially around themselves, blinds them. Is the expression. A person sees all flaws except their own. So we are blinded, but the seichel can help a person when you hear from a mashpia. It was one of the reasons I say l'charav. What's the real role of an objective mashpia, a mentor? Is that they can illuminate for you a blind spot you may have, or something you may not see clearly, or you're minimizing or underestimating and so on. And they show you an objective perspective, but still your emotions can block you. So hopefully the goal is that, but once you see it a little with your mind and say, I didn't see that perspective. Just like you go to a lawyer or an accountant or someone to help you find clarity in a particular dilemma, then even if you have emotional resistance, the emotions now will be more responsive. Now, it's not that easy. Sometimes people understand something and it still doesn't affect their emotions. We'll discuss that more when we get to the emotional part. Right now, he's talking about the seichel of the seichel and the seichel. That's why before v'ahavtas Hashem elkach b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, you have Shema Yisrael. Shema is his bonus in Achdus Hashem. That's the whole theme of Amagbil Sheves, that it starts with the contemplation in the mind of the nefesh elokis, then educating and teaching the nefesh habamis, which is what we're in the middle of. And then we'll talk about how it carries over at the next step. So here's what he says now. Shekol zeh, now keep in mind, like he said in the previous parentheses, even as the nefesh elokis understands the divine down below, and it's now explaining it also nefesh habamis with mishalim and dimyonis, examples and comparisons and parallels and so on. Shekol zeh mailim ala etzem ha'or. As soon as you put it into a lavush of any example, you're concealing the etzem ha'or, because the etzem ha'or is pure For example, how the Nefesh Alikis understands a divine concept, Lamaila. We learned about this in Ayin Beis in earlier, I think in volume 1, volume 2 maybe as well. It understands, for example, let's take a halacha. Take the halacha of, we're coming to the Parshas soon, we're going to learn about Sazriya Mitzera. I'm specifically using a very, very material example. Mitzera is a leper. But we know, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Likutei Torah, that leprosy, even though it is a physical manifestation below, but it's a spiritual ailment, as the Rambam says. And in spirituality, it's a whole level of chokhmah being concealed from bina. It's a whole discussion. So Chassidus brings us that as an example in some places, that the way a neshama learns it, lamaila, it doesn't have any physical example, manifestation. It's all about chokhmah and bina. Just like talking about mayim, water, we talk about water and we say water manifests chesed. In Atzilus, chesed is chesed. You don't need water. But when it comes into the physical world, and you want to explain to Nefesh Habamis, your Mailam al Etzem Ha'or, yes, it's still the divine concept, but it's now bislapshus in these Mishalim B'Dimyenis. The Ilu HaYasogas HaNeshama Bliham Tzayma Elu, because if it was the soul understanding it without these intermediaries, here meaning these interfaces, these examples, and Tzayim in this context, he means here these tools, so to speak, that allow you to explain it in a way that the Seichel Hativi could understand it. Then the Eir Eliki in this idea, in this comprehension, would be radiating far stronger and far more intense than once it's bislapshus in physical examples. U'Mekol Mokim, and at the same time, says the Rebbe Rashab, nevertheless, so now, like we discussed yesterday, here is the issue here. When the Nefesh Elikis is understanding an idea in Bislapshus, when it comes down below into a body and an animal soul, in a way that the animal soul can understand it because it's with Mishalim, with, like he said, comes with Seichel HaTivi. So Nefesh Elikis, on one hand, it's a divine concept. On the other hand, it's in a way that the Nefesh HaTivi, the Seichel HaTivi could understand it. So what is the Nefesh Elikis? The Nefesh Elikis understanding also the Gashmi? He says, yeah. Because if it was just pure, so if it was just the way it is Lamaila, then the Nefesh Elikis is just understanding the concept separate from the physical manifestation that the natural mind can understand. But here, since it comes bislapshus, so how the Nefesh Elikis understands the inyanim chumrim. Remember, the Nefesh Elikis with his seichel, even though its interest is elikus, it doesn't mean it can't understand a scientific idea, or for that matter, anything in Gashmi Sa'elam. It's just not its natural interest. Ubehem va'ayoda masigas ha'inyan eliki. And as it's explaining it, so to speak, in Seichel HaTivi, through the inyanim chumrim, him in them and through them, he understands the inyan eliki, the Nefesh Elikis. And then afterwards, when the Nefesh Elikis strips the idea from its physical example, from this islapshus as it manifests in it, so just like I mentioned about the teacher who gives an example for the student. But then afterwards, let's say you get to the higher level and the teacher goes back to the idea as it is without the example. Then the etzem ha'er of the idea radiates for him. So you have everything covered here. So the Nefesh Elikis on its own Lamaila understands only the Ur. When it comes down Lamata and it manifests within the animal soul, it can explain and understand the idea as it is going through the lens. That's also a good word here for Emtsoim, the lens of the physical world. So Nefesh Habamis can understand, but the Nefesh Elikis is also manifesting in there. And therefore also understands it that way. Like the teacher, when he gives an example, he understands his example, obviously. The reason he's doing it is for the student. But the example also is something the teacher himself is the one that's providing the example, and he's explaining it. But then there's when you separate the example from the idea, like that's called mafshit, from the islapshus hanal, then the etzem ha'er is radiating. Now he doesn't say it radiates in the Nefesh Habamis. So that's a good question. Can the nefesh habamis also arrive at the etzem ha'or without the moshel, without the gashmis? That let's leave to see if he's going to address that or not, and we can discuss it. But right now he's talking about the nefesh halakis, because nefesh halakis is the key force here that is bringing the seichel halaki into levushim, into garments, into the slapshus, into the nefesh hativi, into the seichel hativi of the nefesh habamis. That's what he adds in the parentheses. Okay.
I don't understand. L'chora, the nefesh hativis should be that understands the inyan halaki, not the nefesh halakis masig ha'inyanim
I just gave a
hachumriyim.
simple. When the teacher gives an example to the student, does the teacher understand the example?
Okay, but he said al yoda masig inyan halaki. The nefesh halakis through the inyanim hachumriyim.
Because now he's coming to his slapshus. So when the nefesh halakis is like when the Alter Rebbe or Chassidus Chabad teaches an example from, let's say, koiches hanefesh, or from nature, mipsari echzalaka is the nefesh halakis using gashmi se'elam to use it as an example for alakus. So that's how the nefesh halakis is right now as it manifests in the nefesh habamis. That's what it's doing. Then it could be mafshit and say, okay, let's separate the two, and then the etzem ha'or is radiating in it. He's not talking about the nefesh halakis l'mayla, talking about the nefesh halakis l'mata. He didn't say the nefesh halakis needs the mashal to understand the lakus. That's not what he said. He says the nefesh halakis, when it comes into the nefesh habamis, that's what it does. Like he said, takes a seichel halaki and it's mislabish b'seichel hativi. Now, frankly, you probably could argue that the seichel nefesh halakis lamata will understand it better because it is now engaging with this world. It's like he said, muhus echad. So, can the nefesh halakis understand lamata, pure divine idea without a mashal? That we can discuss. Both ways can be explained that way. You could say it both ways. You could say yes. You could say no, or you could say to some extent. But there's no question that there is the mashal definitely is something nefesh halakis is engaging with.
So I think Vohen al yoda masig inyan halaki is talking about the nefesh hativis.
No, absolutely not. Then he would say that. And then what means k'shemavshit achakach? Well, I can't say absolutely. You know what? I shouldn't say absolutely. Not the way I read it. Because he's talking only about the nefesh halakis in the parentheses, about the neshama. Nefesh halakis masigas inyan chumrim, behema yoda masigas inyan halaki. Who? So we're saying. So why is he saying the nefesh halakis understands the inyanim chumrim?
Because otherwise the nefesh hativis would not understand the nefesh
I wouldn't read it
halakis.
that way. Again, you could force it the other way, but I naturally would read it more the way I'm describing, explaining it.
And one of the inyanim here that the whole davar, even every concept that the nefesh that the sechel hativi can contemplate, even let's say mathematics, in every intellectual concept, there's an inyan eloki. Is that what this is coming to say? Or if there happens to be something spiritual, godly about some seemingly mundane topic, then the nefesh eloki will find it, will discover it once it is mafshit the inyanim chumranim.
I think neither of the two. That's not what he's talking about here.
Oy vey. Okay, I didn't understand it at all. I'm sorry.
No, that he said earlier, that the nefesh halakis, his entire interest is seeing godliness in everything.
Right.
He said that earlier. Now we're talking about the nefesh halakis as a manifest inside the nefesh habamis. If you read the third line from the bottom of last page, before the parentheses, he says, so he's explaining what means that is slapshus, that the koyach ha-seichel of the nefesh halakis is manifesting and enclothing itself in the seichel of the nefesh habamis. So he says, the process is that when the nefesh halakis is understanding a divine idea, it's mislabish and seichel ativi. It's not just understanding the idea, It manifests in also in seichel that the nefesh abamis could understand, with mishalim and demyanis, like a teacher who's giving examples and comparisons and parallels from dvarim hativim, chumrim. So this is now discussing not that the nefesh is searching for godliness in nature. He's talking about explaining an idea, a divine idea, through the lens of nature
I
or
see.
science. That's what he's
Okay.
discussing here.
Thank you
And
for
then
the clarification.
and that does conceal the oir. That's what the parentheses said. Because the
Uh-huh.
asagas on neshama without this lens, without these lenses, the oir leki would be far more be'inarech. U'makom makom ha'nefesh gemasig is yanim chumrim. U'behem v'al yodam masig is ha'inyan aleki.
Reb Simon, I could see it in the way you
Frankly,
said it. Yeah.
when I read it again, to me it's very straightforward. The nefesh lekis understands the yanim chumrim.
I could see it. You're right. Yeah.
No,
Let
one
him
second.
finish.
And hold on. And through that, ubehem, and in that, and through that, it understands the inyan eliki, both for nefesh elikis and nefesh abamis. That's fine. You could say that. And then mafshit achakach, I think he's talking about the nefesh elikis. But you know what? Reading it a second time.
You're right. I think so too.
Yeah, but you read it a second time, I will say this. Not that I'm changing my mind, but you could say that hypothetically, since it's explaining the nefesh lekis and nefesh abamis, maybe the nefesh abamis too understands the inyan eliki now through the mashalim, and then the mafshit, even though Bapashtis is talking about the nefesh lekis, maybe the nefesh abamis could also come to the student at some point could understand the idea beyond the example when they get older, but I'm not sure about that. That's why I'm questioning that. But okay, good.
But I think, like you said, it's talking about the nefesh elokis, the whole thing.
Yeah. But it's the nefesh elokis as it's manifesting in the levushim,
Yes.
like he says, the amtsoyim of dvarim yonim achumrim. It's basically, to put it in simple terms, it's like looking with eyes through shades, through, let's say, sunglasses. So the eyes themselves are like the divine soul, but it's looking through through sunglasses, the lens of something from this material world. It's looking at Elikus through the lens of the existent world. So that is essentially, it's like looking at something through a lavush, through a garment. I think that's a good way to explain it as well. And again, emphasizing that on its own, the nefesh elokis is not interested in yanim chumrim. It's only here understanding elikus through in yanim chumrim. Very different. Whereas the nefesh abamis does naturally gravitate that, and now we're training it. So that's the seichel of the nefesh elokis as a manifest nefesh abamis. Now he continues. Ukamoy came ba'amidus. So now the same thing. If the seichel of the nefesh elokis is mislabish, and enclose itself in the seichel of nefesh abamis, how about the midas of the nefesh elokis? Based on what he said before, that every koyach prati of the divine soul manifests in the respective koyach prati of the animal soul. So the same thing is midas. So kamoy came by midas, the same thing with the emotions, not just the seichel. Hagam she'em meruchakim zeh mezeh betachlis, even though, as we explained, they are diametrically opposed, betachlis, utterly separate from each other, distant from one another, because one's midas gravitate to its own interests and needs, or to the yesh and gashmias. The nefesh elokis midas gravitate toward elikus. So menuchakim zeh mezeh betachlis be'etzem inyanim shezeh chayfetz be'elikus. The nefesh elokis desires and godliness, v'zeh bechumrius, and the nefesh abamis desires crassness, material, of the physical world. But kol mokim, so that's how they are on their own initially. The kol mokim, now that they've come together, oifen hachefetz v'arotz nefesh elokisu k'fi oifen ha'atfa the nefesh abamis. This is very powerful statement, that the manner, the way the desire of the nefesh elokis is for elikus is k'fi oifen. Now that it came into a nefesh abamis, it's not ignoring it, and it's not oblivious of it. It's k'fi oifen ha'atfa the nefesh abamis, which simply means, he's going to say it inside, that the nefesh abamis is wired a certain way. Let's say we talked about Chasadim by Shanim Rachmanim Gaim Chasadim. Let's say the personality of this person, Nefesh Habamis, is a kind personality, or a different type of personality. So we're talking here Chesed of the Nefesh Habamis. So the Chesed of the Nefesh Halikis, which on its own were separate from the animal soul, on its own has Chesed, kindness, but it's a divine kindness. But now it will shape itself according to the levush, exactly like a garment of the Nefesh Habamis. If not for the Nefesh Habamis, ukamoi. And here he explains it. Kasherat for hagashmi shalei. When the very nature of a person, the very physical nature he's talking about, he bar kovas b'chinas midas hachesed, is a compositive. Its ingredients, it's made up of, it's comprised of midas hachesed, the midah, the faculty, the attribute of kindness. Tia k'moy kein avedosei la'Hashem. His service of God, of the Nefesh Halikis, will also be in that kav. B'chinas hachesed, gam kein b'chinas hachesed. U'kamei shekoseh b'mokam acher. Whereas a person, let's say, whose personality is more gvura, more discipline, we're talking about gvura the Kedusha even. A Kedusha, gvura neutral, reshus. Gvura, he's more of a disciplined person. Not as giving, but more calculated, more discretionary, etc. So his Avodas Hashem of the Nefesh Halikis will be commensurate and tailored to the levush of the Nefesh Habamis, the teva of the Nefesh Habamis. He doesn't say gvura. I'm just giving, just for contrast purposes. He only gives chesed as the example. So what you see here is, what you see here is something really fascinating. Hold on, let me finish. I'm middle of discussing something here. Hold on. So what you see here is a fascinating thing, that the seichel would make more sense, because the seichel, this Nefesh Habamis, has intelligence. So fine, even though its intelligence on its own is driven by self-interest, but it can listen to the Nefesh Halikis. It intrigues the Nefesh Habamis as well. But the midas, you could say the midas, but here he's saying, because the Nefesh Halikis, so to speak, gets closer to the Nefesh Habamis, which will allow the Nefesh Habamis to be able to listen to the Nefesh Halikis. Because it's not like the Nefesh Halikis is just simply coming and steamrolling and saying, I love God, and that's that. It's doing so through the lens and through the personality of the person. So the personality of the person is engaged in that Avodas Hashem, which I think is tremendous, because when you learn Perek Tes and Tanya, there's a war going on. Two kings fighting over the Irktan Ozeh Guf, the small city, which is the body, the person of the human being. And the question is, who's going to dominate? Who's going to win? Will you wake up in the morning? The Nefesh Habamis says to you, sleep a little long. The Nefesh Halikis says, no, you got to get up. Have it. Ratz Kitzvi, Os Kanemer, you have to daven, you have to learn. So there's a battle going on. And then one wins and one doesn't. That battle, at least. Then the battle could be won by the other. Here he's going further. He's saying that the Nefesh Halikis, wisely, is engaging with the Nefesh Habam, is that I am using your very nature to serve Hashem with. Just like in the Seichel, using the lens of physical world to understand godliness, Nefesh Halikis is fitting and tailored to the personality of the Teva of the Nefesh Habamis. That's what he's saying. Now it's interesting, this is the Rebbe Rashab's addition. It's not the Mittler Rebbe. This is at least, maybe it's from his father, Rebbe Marash. I have to look around if I can find it, but I have not yet found it. This is clearly an addition of the Rebbe Rashab explaining the Hamidus work in Nefesh Halikis and Nefesh Habamis. Just 1 second before I take it. Okay. Any questions?
This is very powerful. But you have only a question. How is the Nefesh Halikis before the Islam?
I just gave an example.
Is the Nefesh Halikis
Lamaila,
neutral,
chesed,
not
Avos Hashem, and it's just as chesed, kindness. It doesn't necessarily have to speak to the chesed of the Nefesh Habamis. The difference would be, I guess one is, remember the chesed of Nefesh Habamis. I'll give you the example of the. I don't know if it works here, but I'll give the example. The Baal Shem Tov's example, the long example. I often use it. It's a very powerful example. the king that sends away his child from the kingdom, from his palace, in order to train him to become independent, and he should be able to make it begin to appreciate, because as long as the son of the king is in the palace of the king, he's spoiled, he's taken care of. To have a veidim amatla, to use language of Ayin Beis, in other words, that he should do it at his own initiative. The king sends away his son from the palace, so he can learn to live among the people, and therefore learn their ways, and not being protected by the king and his ministers and his attendants, but to remind the child that the king sent him there, because he would forget after a while. He sends him a letter several times a year to remind him, and then he wants to celebrate. The only way to celebrate, what is he going to tell the people in the town that he lives? He's going to tell them, I'm the king's son. They'll either think he's crazy, or they'll be resentful, or they'll hurt him. So he throws a party, and free lunch, free kiddush, free cocktails for everybody. So the city is celebrating, the people in the city are celebrating because they get a free good meal. And meanwhile, the king's son can celebrate with them without them disturbing him, because he received a letter from his father. It says the Baal Shem Tov, the father is Hashem, the Neshama is the child. The Neshama in Gan Eden lives in a palace. It's comfortable, there are no challenges, doesn't have to earn its way, there's no effort. It naturally gravitates to Likus, like we're learning here. So Hashem sends the neshama lamata, me'igra rama lebira mikta, from the heavens above, from the roof above, all the way bira mikta to a deep pit below, like we've been learning. Shcheirani, a dark world. The nefesh halikis is concealed. It's now living in a gufa nefesh habamis, and lives among the citizens of this world, who don't even recognize or know that there's the king, or it's all concealed. And yet Hashem, from time to time, whether it's Shabbos or Yom Tov, or the Baal Shem Tov's examples also, we say L'chaim. Why? Because you can remember there's Hashem on a Yom Tov or a Shabbos, and you want to celebrate, but the people in the world, your Guf and Nefesh Habam, is not interested in celebrating divine revelations of Shabbos. So Hashem says, you know what? Feed the animal soul good food on Shabbos. Shont, kishke, kugel, a good drink. Let it rest a little more. Give it, fill its needs. So Nefesh Habamis is getting what it needs. And meanwhile, the Nefesh Halikis can celebrate that it's Shabbos today, Shabbos LaHashem. Unfortunately, many people just have forgotten the Ruchnisdika part and only do the Gashmisdika part. The whole Kavanah is the other way around. So in a sense, you can use that moshel to understand how the Nefesh Halikis engages with the Nefesh Habamis. That's like you have to speak the language, because if not, the Nefesh Habamis won't cooperate. Go tell the Nefesh Habamis that today is Shabbos, and I need to speak to Hashem right now. Nefesh Habamis is not interested. But if you do something for Nefesh Habamis on its terms, and it can appreciate it because, getting a good meal, great. The Behema understands that. And then you say this is because of Shabbos, so you're able to communicate Nefesh Habamis, and meanwhile, it's really a Gilead Lakus that's happening here. So perhaps you can say, I'm using the example just to help understand a bit more, that the Nefesh Halikis on its own wouldn't need all this. It wouldn't need to throw a party, and it wouldn't need to bring food to the table, and wouldn't need to feed the Nefesh Habamis altogether. In Gan Eden, there are no Kiddushim, at least not physical ones. So it's Dafka Lamata that now, that since the Nefesh Habamis has a Teva, now some Nefesh Habamis have the Teva, they like Kishke, others like Kugel, some like both, some like other foods. So basically, I'm just giving a little tongue-in-cheek, but the Hatfa shall Nefesh Habamis, the Nefesh Halikis is working Avedis Hashem through the Hatfa. Here he gave the example of Chesed. So my understanding is that Nefesh Habamis has natural Chesed. A person, for example, likes people. So what the Nefesh Halikis will do and say, you know what, let's invite guests. Achnasas Archim is an element of Chesed. Nefesh Habamis says, great, I like to be social. I like people. I'm a Chesed. I'm a Nefesh Habamis that has Chesed. Now, if the Nefesh Habamis didn't have that much Chesed, that doesn't mean Nefesh Halikis doesn't have Chesed. It just means it would work a different way. Let's say Nefesh Habamis has other qualities, whether it's Gvura or Teferes or Netzach or Hoid, So in each case, the nefesh halikis works, like he says, "K'fi efen ha'atfa the nefesh habamis."
Can you take a question, please?
This is
Just a moment. Just a
Rabbi
moment.
Yitzchak,
Just a moment.
could
Just a
I
moment.
just
Just a moment. Hold on a second. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sounds like Rabbi Teichel wasn't finished yet, but I have a question. Go ahead, please, Rabbi Teichel.
you gave a beautiful explanation, Rabbi Simon. Thank you, Rabbi Yitzchak. But we know the concept about the Alter Rebbe brings in Perek Dalet, Sheresh Nafshe Lemailo, that every neshama is having a Sheresh Nefesh. So let's say that the neshama is having a Sheresh from Gvur, and comes down in the Nefesh Abamis that is like Chesed. So
It's an
just to make
interesting.
it a little more clear, how is this work?
Well, he doesn't address that. In other words, could it be that, for example, that from the Menorah, he talks about Le'ischon L'Kutei Torah, the Shiva Kani HaMenorah, the 7 branches of the Menorah, of the candelabra, is Chesed through Malchus, and there's neshamas that come from Chesed, neshamas that come from Gvura, just like the Shvatim, Ruven, Shimon, Levi, etc. So that's Mitzad Nefesh Halikis itself. So the question is a neshama from Chesed going to come into a Nefesh Abamis whose Teva is Chesed? I don't know. Interesting question. Whether that's accurate, not dafka. I could see a case where the Nefesh Halikis is Chesed and the Teva of the Nefesh Abamis may not be, but it's something to discuss and think about. I haven't thought about it. I don't recall seeing it in Chassidus. So I don't know if that's what you're asking explicitly, but that is definitely something to be discussed. Here, I don't think you can derive anything from what we learned here one way or the other, because here he's just saying, period, that Nefesh
That was
Halikis
my question.
works Kafi Eifon Hatfa.
That was my question.
Yeah, I here, there's nothing here that would indicate one way or another, because he doesn't speak about the Hatfa of the
I
Nefesh
understand.
Halikis. But it's an interesting question. You know, it's like a bit like when we talk about Achlifa Dechtayu. There's the concept of Eir HaChesed B'Klei HaGvura. There's Eir HaGvura B'Klei HaChesed. I don't know if you could say that on the Shamas. I'm not sure. But I'll look around, I'll keep my eyes open. Maybe there's something that Chassidus says. I mean, I could speculate both directions, but I'd rather right now not do that because it's not really, from here, we're not going to be able to really get a conclusive answer to that.
Thank you.
My question is quite a subtle one on the sugya here. Previously, I had understood that in this, it's almost like a dialogue, a subtle one, between the Nefesh Elokis and Nefesh Bahamas, where the Nefesh Elokis is trying to explain to the Nefesh Bahamas more sublime matters, to transcend the immediate physical, the apparent immediate nature, physical nature of whatever the matter of the world happens to be, and to say, you know what, that may be true at one level, but actually there's a higher level to understand what's really happening. And listen to what I have to say about this. Look, within, let's say, this tree, it's not just a tree. It's not just it's a creation of God. It actually has its own soul of sorts. And there's greater depth in understanding everything in the world if you open your mind, Sechel Hativi, to the godless of Elikus, that there's a dimension of reality that is.
Are you leading to a question, or you're just asking me if you're understanding it correctly?
No, I'm asking you a question. So one is an effort to persuade the Nefesh Bahamas, and maybe it's in terms the Chumrim, okay, because that's what the Nefesh Bahamas understands. But one is an effort to persuade and get the Nefesh Sechel Hativi to buy in consciously. But what this seems to be saying here is a little bit of brainwashing. It's a little bit of I'm gonna sort of seduce you, and if I. Do you understand the difference?
So let me just stop you right here, if I may. that's because you're processing before we finish the topic. You're literally in the middle of the topic. He hasn't finished. He's still in the middle of discussing it. So I think we should wait to see how he defines it. You're processing, assuming that's what he's going to be saying. Right now, we're in the middle of the topic. He spoke about seichel, spoke now about midas. Just go back to the words that on the nefesh halikis, actually is the opposite. It's like a teacher accommodating the nature of the student. The nature of the student is chesed. So the eifon of Avedis Hashem is through chesed. So really what you're talking about is the mashal I gave from the Baal Shem Tov. But I would wait just to see how the Rebbe Rashab continues explaining based on that, the nefesh halikis effect on the nefesh habamis. Right now he's just talking about the process. He didn't yet conclude, so what does this do to the nefesh habamis? So I would just wait before asking that question, because then it'll be a lot clearer. And if you still have a question, I'm happy to answer it then. But I would wait till the whole topic is finished.
Okay. You understand the question though, right?
I'm not processing, so I'm not. I heard what you said, but I'm not applying myself to it right
Well,
now.
but I am really trying to understand what it says here. What's
Okay,
going
but we're in
on
the middle
here.
of a sentence. It's like the Rebbe is saying a mimer, and he didn't finish the mimer yet. Let's just finish this topic, and then we can, I'm just go back to. I heard what you said, and I said let's wait till
Yeah,
we
okay.
finish, and if the question is still there, we'll revisit it.
Yeah,
What's
okay.
wrong
So
with that?
just I'm dropping a footnote for myself. I'm going to call this, is this persuasion or seduction? And then we'll leave it at that, and we'll see if he answers the question.
Yeah.
But in
I
the
wish I would-
past, Rabbi Jacobson, he did discuss this matter in the whole matter of sweetening and the bitter waters. If you remember, there was 3 levels. There was one that was like there was so much sweetness that it overwhelmed the bitterness. There was the second level, which Ishak is talking to, which is like you're convincing the other side. You have not changed it, but you convinced the other side that this is the right thing. And then the third level was the actual transformation of the bitter waters themselves. So that parallels that idea. I mean, Rabbi Rashab did discuss this, way back.
You could apply that as well. That's also processing. You could also bring chapter 9 of Tanya, where he actually talks about 9 levels, if you really count, of when one king is fighting with another. Even if he wins, it doesn't mean he transformed the enemy into a friend. And then there's stages. So yes, you absolutely can discuss it in context of stages of transformation. But I would wait till we finish, and then we can go through and say, okay, are there stages? What's stage 1, stage 2, stage 3? Because look, at the end of the day, everything is a maturity process. Mutva, murgish, muskel, b'chol avavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha. So right now, he's talking about the very process, the very way. Remember, the first thing was that nefesh l'kis, nefesh habamis are 2 diametric opposites in every possible way, from the seichel level and the midas level, even more so the midas. But Hashem brings them together, and they're way to the point that the nefesh halikis and nefesh habamis kimuhus echad. The seichel of the nefesh halikis engages with the seichel of the nefesh habamis. Now he said also the midas, that the way the nefesh halikis serves Hashem is through the lens and through the channeled through the infinite flow of the nefesh habamis. That's where we're up to. So let's see how he continues, and we could always go back and discuss different levels of transformation and so on and so forth. Okay.
By the way, yeah, just wanted to thank George. George, that was a really nice insight, and thank you for that.
No worries. Thank Rabbi Rashab. He's the one who brought it up.
Yeah, you have a good memory. Thank you too, Rabbi Jacobson.
So continuing on, now that we've established that the faculties of the divine soul manifest within the faculties of the animal soul and work through that lens, both seichel and midas. So because the faculties of nefesh l'kis, mulaboshim b'keiches the nefesh habamis, they manifest getting clothed, melubash, which is a internal manifestation, be'efim pnimi. Remember, that's a levush. Maiver means it just passes through. It's like a funnel. It's not like a funnel. It's like a garment where the entire body is dressed in that garment. Al-Kain, and because of that, therefore, Ba'asogav is bonus the nefesh halikis, Now that we know their profound and their deep connection, therefore, but through the comprehension and contemplation of the divine soul, Yiful Zeis, that very understanding and comprehension and contemplation will affect Shagam HaNefesh HaBamis, B'sichle HaTivin, that also the animal soul, with its natural intelligence, because it has intelligence. However, until the Nefesh HaLekis engaged with it, it was drawn to its own needs, self-interest, yeshes, gashmis, chumrius. That also Nefesh HaTiv, Seichel HaTivi, of the B'sichle HaTivi, Yovin es ha'inyan Elokhi. Even it will understand this divine concept, because the Nefesh HaLekis has come to. The Nefesh HaLekis didn't just preach from an ivory tower, but the Nefesh HaLekis is doing it through the levush of the skeichus of the Nefesh HaBamis. The Ein Zadak Masha Nefesh HaLekis Mevin es ha'inyan Elokhi. And he's now emphasizing even more. It's not that the Nefesh HaLekis is just the Nefesh HaLekis understands the divine concept, B'slapshus b'seichel HaTivi. Because that would be one step. That the way the Nefesh HaLekis is understanding the divine concept is through Seichel HaTivi, through a scientific example, or through nature, or through the human body, or whatever it may be. It's more than that. Ki'im shemishtadl. It's a key point here. So it's not just Nefesh HaLekis is doing this as its own private enterprise, understanding godliness through the levushim of Teva, or B'seichel HaTivi. It's more than that. Ki'im, rather, shemishtadl, umisasik. The Nefesh HaLekis is making an exerted effort and getting an involvement, engaging ima seichel HaTivi the Nefesh HaBamis, with the natural seichel of the animal soul. Sheyovin gam kenes ha'inyan, that the animal soul should also understand the idea. V'yunach etzlei b'teiv, and it should resonate well with it, within the Seichel TV of the Nefesh HaBamis. That's why I gave the example of a teacher and a student. A teacher on his own could also come to understand an idea through nature and so on. But then he's on his own. Here there's an additional element. The Nefesh HaLekis is actually making an exerted effort. Like he says, mishtadl, umisasik, to make sure that the Seichel and Nefesh HaBamis understands it well, to resonate in an internalized way in the Nefesh HaBamis.
Where do you see it? The explanation before is only that the Nefesh HaLekis.
Where do you see it?
Understand.
You see it by someone who does the Saveda. It doesn't happen automatic. That's why I always say, if you daven for 25 minutes, all of Shachris, you're not going to see it. This is going to require a person sitting and saying Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and contemplating Hamayich be'echad. If someone does that, what do you think they're doing? The Nefesh HaLekis is making an effort to understand the godly concept, understand it in the levushim of Seichel HaTivi, explaining it to the Nefesh HaBamis. That takes time. That's where I always talk about the lost art of prayer. So if you want to see it, you have to either do it or watch someone who's doing it. Doesn't happen. Like the Maggid said to his chaver, that if you really want the scheda, it takes time. He asked him how he davens, so why is he davening so long? He gave a whole example. He says, if you want the material, the scheda, you have to travel and get there. So tefillah is a journey.
You have to be there.
It's like, sulam mutzav.
You have to be there.
It's a ladder, and you have to climb the ladder. Unfortunately, most davening is not like that. You know the story that Baal Shem Tov once came to a town. He asked where there's a shul. They showed him a shul, and to the davening, and he went in. It came running out. He said, "It's packed. I can't daven there." So they asked him, "It's not packed. There's barely a minyan." So he says, "It says tefillah, b'lei kavana is ke'if, like a bird. The lei parche le'ela doesn't fly without wings. It needs ava v'yira kavana." And he sees there's tefillahs going on, and it's not flying upward. So the whole house shul is packed with tefillahs that have never, like grounded birds, and there's no room to daven. He felt the pressure of grounded prayers that are not going up to heaven. So tefillah is more than just mechanical lip service. It's an aveda, and the aveda of isbananus, and b'chlal, the Nefesh HaLekis working hard and trying to. That's the key. The whole of Tanya is based on that. if you're not going to work with the nefesh halikis, the nefesh habamis is very powerful. There's going to be a battle, at least, probably more than that. That's why a person's a rasha v'tevlei as soon as the nefesh habamis affects their thought, speech, and action. How do you stop that? That takes aveda. So that's where you see it. And then let me finish the paragraph.
Makes sense.
1 second. What? You understand? Okay, good. And then now that the natural intelligence, also the natural intelligence understands and comprehends the divine concept. Then comes step 2. Then, as the midas of nefesh halikis get excited and passionate about it, with a fiery love, with a love that is like with a fire, with sparks of fire, or flames of fire, or the fiery flames of love. Tislav v'tislav gam b'nefesh habamis b'hava. Then also the nefesh habamis will get ignited and burn and become a flame with love. If the nefesh habamis is not affected by these bonus, so it's like left separate. Like I said before, the nefesh halikis is doing its thing. Nefesh habamis is not affected. But when this bonus is such that influences the nefesh habamis and understands, then when the midas of the nefesh halikis in turn. So in other words, when Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that is bonus, also affects the nefesh habamis. Then, when it comes to V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, it'll be B'chol Levavcha B'shnei Yitzarecha, because the nefesh habamis is now receptive to that, because it's understanding and appreciating the godliness. Now, you could ask the question: what happens if you don't have these bonus and only the nefesh halikis is passionate? Will the nefesh habamis be affected by that? Next paragraph will discuss more of that and more details. So you see here, he's slowly unpacking and developing the process of how a nefesh halikis influences a nefesh habamis in a way that ultimately will affect it and transform it. But it's a step-by-step process, because they initially, keep in mind, they're two opposites, and you needed nifloyas Hashem, the wonders of God, a miracle literally, to bring them together in the first place. But now, once they are, the way they come together is conducive and is structured in a way that the nefesh halikis can impact the nefesh habamis, seichel, and from seichel to midas, which he's going to speak now in the next section, which we'll learn in the next class. He's going to speak about, so what does this say that Aveda now? So how do we actually do this? What's the process? So he laid out the key points. Now he's going to further explain this. He's going to go like another page, and then begins a longer discussion on the very hisbonenus itself. What exactly does the contemplation consist of? Because he didn't speak here, what is the hisbonenus? He just said, the seichel eliki. He didn't say, what are we contemplating on? So that's going to come later, the Achdus Hashem and all the details involved. That's really going to go till the end of Hemshech Ayin Beis. But this is the flow where we are right now. Okay.
This is very powerful and amazing.
Yeah, this is quintessential Chassidus that teaches you how to serve Hashem and engage. It's not about ignoring the nefesh habamis and not about overriding it. It's about engaging with it and ultimately impacting it at many different levels, as we shall learn about that.
If somebody is coming and speaks very great things about spiritual things, but he's not putting it down to the level of the people, it's not doing the job.
Exactly. And it's still going to be work. It's a lot of work.
That's
Remember, in Pedig Yud Beis and Tanya, he speaks about how tefillah, eis rotzen of tefillah affects the nefesh habamis, like puts it to sleep, so to speak, keeps it at bay. It suppresses and silences it. But then right after davening, what happens? Nefesh habamis awakens again, and you got the battle. So there's moyach shal ta'alev. This is very much connected. Exactly. So exactly. So it's Aveda, it's a lifetime Aveda, as he explains in Tanya. This doesn't happen, even if you accomplish this, you still have to keep doing it. That's why every day we daven again, etc. Okay. Yeah. Talk about Aveda. This is Aveda. Are there any questions? We're all okay, good. Yeah, the next section will help understand a lot of things, I believe. And good. There's no question also when you read this, you see the Rebbe Rashab's real explanation of the Maimer HaMagbiel L'Sheves, because everything we're learning here is the essential theme of that Maimer, of how the Nefesh Elikis, through his bonanus, affects the Nefesh Habamis, that it should become Shemen, that the oil of the Nefesh, of the Seichel of the Nefesh Habamis should become fuel for the Mides, for V'ahavtas Hashem Lekecha, Kirish B'Av Kirish B'Esh, for the flame of Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. That's the core of the message here. But here he's actually explaining it in detailed dynamics, the detailed dynamics, not just making the statement. But if you go back to the Maimon Tereir, you see how rich it is. Because all this is there, but you don't see it initially. The Rebbe Rashab spells it out. With the Mittler Rebbe's, obviously, the Mittler Rebbe spells it out to some extent, the Rebbe Rashab even more. It's to me, it's one of the most blatant examples where you see Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, and Rebbe Rashab at work in a very clear way, crystal clear way, what one adds over the next. And together, obviously, you have the whole picture. You could also figure out, like Mishnah and Gemara, that those the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe clearly understood this when they learned that Maimer. It's the later generations needed more explanation. But at the same time, I'm sure that if the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe would read Ayin Beis, they would appreciate it as well, because I'm sure there'd be some things that would add to their understanding as well. Okay. So we'll stop here. End of paragraph, page 1465.
I think it's your grandfather, Gershom Bell. So I hear about him. He was a very big chassid and big oived. But I heard something, I don't remember clear, that big things somebody said about him, but Ayin Samach Vav he did not see. He was before. And
Right.
which means that even though that he was a very, very big chassid, he didn't.
Yeah, it would be
So
interesting to hear what he
Ayin
would
Beis.
say to this. I'd be very fascinated to hear what he had to say about what we're learning here. I'm sure he had much to say. I will say this, just as an example, since you mentioned Gershom Ber Pahada, my father's named after him, the great-great-grandfather of ours, yeah. So, we're talking about Sfira Se'emer, talk about speaking the language of the Nefesh Habamis. So he was known, there's Ovis Hachsidis, the Rebbe Friedrich Rebbe in Hatomim has a whole section on him. It's unbelievable stuff. So I think one of the I don't know if that story is told there, but somewhere that he was heard saying when he counted Sfira, he said, Hayem yem echad la'emer. Hayem yem echad la'emer. Heint is ein tog in emer. Translated into Yiddish. And afterwards he explained, my nefesh habamis versteht besser Yiddish. My animal soul understands better Yiddish. So even though obviously they make the bracha on the Hebrew, but he kept on trying to explain it to his nefesh habamis, and his nefesh habamis understands Hebrew better, Yiddish better. Just like we would try to say it in English, because we understand English better. That's a perfect example of what the Nefesh Elikis is working. Now, his Neshama L'Mayla does not have to say it in Yiddish, because the Neshama L'Mayla, the only language is Hebrew there. But it's an interesting example. My Nefesh Habamis versteht, my soul, my animal soul understands better Yiddish, or English, or Russian, or French, or whatever the language may be. Since you mentioned him, I think it's a good example for what we're learning here. Anyway, I like that example. especially considering it's from